On the 19th of November 2025, President Donald Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stood together in Riyadh and signed a document that both governments described as the U.S.-Saudi Strategic Defense Agreement, a formal security pact that simultaneously designated Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally of the United States, the most significant upgrade in the formal structure of the American-Saudi security relationship in the history of the two countries' partnership, going back to the original meeting between President Franklin Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in 1945. The signing ceremony was the culmination of years of Saudi lobbying for exactly this kind of legally structured American commitment, a commitment that would bind future American administrations to Saudi Arabia's defense in ways that informal understandings, arms sales relationships, and security consultations had never been able to do because they lacked the legal and institutional architecture that treaty relationships provide. But the Strategic Defense Agreement, significant as it was in formalizing the American-Saudi security partnership, was not even the most consequential security document that Saudi Arabia had signed in the months leading up to the Iran war that began on February 28, 2026. 2 months before the Trump MBS agreement on the 17th of September 2025, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had stood together at Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh and signed the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, a collective defense pact whose central provision mirrored the language of NATO's Article 5 and stated explicitly that any act of aggression against either Saudi Arabia or Pakistan shall be considered an act of aggression against both nations. Pakistan is a nuclear power. It possesses an estimated arsenal of 150 to 160 nuclear warheads and a well-developed nuclear missile delivery system, including short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets across the entire Middle East. The SMDA, as analysts immediately recognized, was the first military pact between an Arab Gulf state and a nuclear power in the entire history of modern international relations, and it created what analysts described as the first nuclear umbrella in the Islamic world, founded not on Western guarantees, but on mutual Muslim solidarity, reinforced by shared strategic interests and decades of military, religious, and economic cooperation between Riyadh and Islamabad. Then, in early 2026, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan began formalizing a four-nation security cooperation framework whose foreign ministers met for the first time, formally, on the 19th of March 2026, in Riyadh, on the sidelines of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a meeting that Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan described with characteristic bluntness by saying that either they came together and learned to solve their own problems themselves, or an external hegemon would come and either impose solutions that served its own interests, or do nothing while preventing others from acting. By that date, Iran had launched nearly 100 drones at Saudi Arabia in a single day, the biggest single-day strike since the war began, striking the Saudi Aramco ExxonMobil refinery and targeting Prince Sultan Air Base with ballistic missiles that pushed Saudi air defenses to their operational limits. What Saudi Arabia had built in the 18 months before that attack was not a single defense agreement, but a layered and interlocking architecture of security relationships that collectively represented the most fundamental transformation of Saudi Arabia's strategic position since the kingdom was established. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand exactly what the U.S.-Saudi Strategic Defense Agreement commits Washington to, and what major non-NATO ally status actually means in practice, what the Saudi-Pakistani Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement's nuclear dimension actually means for Iranian strategic calculations, and why Tehran finds it genuinely alarming, how the four-nation Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan framework changes the regional balance of power in ways no previous Arab coalition has achieved, why MBS chose to pursue multiple overlapping security architectures rather than relying on any single alliance, what the origins of these agreements reveal about MBS's long-term strategic vision, and whether this historic restructuring of Saudi security relationships has actually achieved the deterrence against Iran that motivated every element of its construction. To understand why Saudi Arabia undertook this extraordinary and historically unprecedented restructuring of its security relationships in the 18 months before the Iran war began, you have to understand the specific vulnerabilities that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his security advisors had identified in the kingdom's existing defense architecture, and why those vulnerabilities had become impossible to ignore by the second half of 2025. Saudi Arabia had been spending approximately $74 billion per year on defense in 2026, making it the fifth largest defense spender in the world and the largest in the entire Middle East by a margin that dwarfed its regional neighbors. It operated American F-15 fighter jets and the most advanced variants of those aircraft, Patriot air defense systems, THAAD missile defense batteries, whose capabilities exceeded those deployed by most NATO members, and a range of other American-supplied weapon systems that gave it a qualitative military edge over most regional adversaries. But, as the Iran war would later confirm in the most brutal and costly practical terms, 3 structural weaknesses had rendered this impressive and expensive arsenal insufficient for the specific threat environment that Saudi Arabia faced in the post-Gaza, post-Soleimani era of escalating Iranian regional ambition. The first weakness was that Saudi Arabia's military had been optimized over decades for counterterrorism operations and for the Yemen war, rather than for homeland defense against a sophisticated state adversary with extensive ballistic missile capabilities, a comprehensive drone production and deployment network, and a carefully cultivated system of proxy forces spread across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen that could strike Saudi territory from multiple directions simultaneously and overwhelm any single layer of air defense, no matter how capable. The second weakness was that American military support, while real and substantial and ultimately decisive in the kind of large-scale conflict that the Iran war became, required the presence of American bases on Saudi soil, a domestic political cost that MBS had been trying to minimize since his rise to power because the presence of non-Muslim military forces in the land of the 2 holy mosques has been a politically sensitive issue in Saudi Arabia since the Gulf War of 1991 first brought large numbers of American troops onto Saudi territory. The third and most fundamental weakness was that no existing agreement legally bound the United States to defend Saudi Arabia in the way that NATO's Article 5 bound American defense commitments to European allies, creating a structural vulnerability in which the reliability of American protection depended on the political calculations of whichever administration happened to be in power in Washington at the moment Saudi Arabia most needed help. Saudi Arabia's difficult experience with the Biden administration's hesitation to respond forcefully to Iranian proxy attacks on Saudi infrastructure, including the devastating Abqaiq attack of 2019 that cut Saudi oil production in half for weeks, had convinced MBS that informal understandings between governments were not an adequate foundation for the kingdom's security in a region where Iran was growing more assertive, more technically capable, and more willing to absorb international costs in pursuit of regional dominance. The SMDA with Pakistan, the SDA with the United States, and the four-nation framework with Turkey and Egypt were all responses to exactly the same underlying strategic diagnosis. Saudi Arabia needed legally structured, multilaterally reinforced, and ideally nuclear-backed defense commitments that would deter Iranian aggression through the certainty of consequence, rather than the ambiguity of informal relationships. The origins of the Saudi-Pakistani security relationship that produced the SMDA predate the current crisis by decades, and by a depth of military, religious, and economic cooperation that makes the 2 countries' partnership genuinely unique in the Muslim world. Pakistan had been deploying troops to Saudi Arabia since the 1960s, when Pakistani military forces first arrived on Saudi frontiers over fears of Egyptian involvement in the North Yemen civil war. Pakistani pilots had flown for the Saudi Air Force during various periods of the Cold War. Tens of millions of Pakistani workers lived and worked in Saudi Arabia, sending remittances home that constituted a critical component of Pakistan's foreign exchange earnings. Saudi Arabia had been a major financial supporter of Pakistan through multiple economic crises, providing oil at concessional rates and depositing billions of dollars in the State Bank of Pakistan to prevent currency crises. The Pakistani nuclear program itself, which Zulfikar Ali Bhutto famously described as something his people would achieve even if they had to eat grass, had received financial support from Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, during its development in the 1970s and 1980s, creating a connection between Pakistani nuclear capability and Gulf state security interests that predated the SMDA by 4 decades. When MBS sat down with Prime Minister Sharif at Al Yamama Palace on September 17, 2025, to sign the SMDA, he was not creating a new relationship from nothing. He was giving formal legal structure and a collective defense commitment to a relationship whose practical foundations had been built across generations of military cooperation, religious solidarity, and economic interdependence. That historical depth is what gives the SMDA its credibility as a deterrent, because Iran's military planners understand that Pakistan's commitment to Saudi Arabia is not a paper arrangement created for political purposes, but a reflection of relationships that run through every level of both societies. The U.S.-Saudi Strategic Defense Agreement, signed in November 2025, represented the fulfillment of an American security commitment that the Biden administration had been negotiating for years, but had failed to finalize, partly because of the linkage that the Biden team had sought to make between the defense agreement and Saudi-Israeli normalization as part of a broader Abraham Accords expansion effort. The Trump administration, which returned to power in January 2025 with a different set of priorities and a more transactional approach to alliance management, moved quickly to conclude the SDA without the Israeli normalization conditionality that had complicated the Biden-era negotiations. The agreement's formal designation of Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally was the most visible and symbolically significant element, placing the kingdom in the same legal category as Australia, Japan, South Korea, Israel, and other close American security partners whose relationship with Washington carries specific legal and institutional benefits. Major non-NATO ally status provides access to certain defense technologies that are not available to ordinary arms customers, priority treatment in American government arms sales processes that can accelerate delivery timelines during crises, the ability to participate in certain American defense research and development programs, and most importantly, a formal legal signal to potential adversaries that attacking the designated ally would be treated as an attack on American interests, requiring a response. The Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute analysis described what the SDA committed Washington to in practical operational terms. Saudi armed forces would benefit from continuous technical advice and support from the U.S. military, giving Riyadh the kind of embedded American military expertise that transforms sophisticated weapon systems from expensive equipment into genuinely effective combat capabilities. The United States would enjoy greater access to Saudi territory and airspace, formalizing and expanding the military footprint that American forces had maintained in the kingdom since the Gulf War of 1991. American access to Saudi airspace and territory proved immediately critical when the Iran War began on February 28th, with American B-2 stealth bombers and other aircraft using Saudi territory and overflight rights as part of the regional basing architecture that enabled the strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Saudi Arabia's decision not to publicly acknowledge or endorse those strike packages was calibrated to preserve its diplomatic relationships with Arab and Muslim states, while still providing the practical military access that made the strikes possible, exactly the kind of nuanced cooperation that the SDA's formal structure enabled by creating agreed frameworks for military access that did not require public political announcements for each specific use. The nuclear dimension of both the SMDA with Pakistan and the SDA with the United States was the most carefully managed and simultaneously most strategically significant element of the entire security architecture that MBS constructed. Pakistan's Defense Minister Khawaja Asif initially hinted explicitly at the nuclear sharing aspect of the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, telling reporters that it encompassed all military means before later backtracking and denying that the agreement required Pakistan to use nuclear weapons in the defense of Saudi Arabia. A senior Saudi official told Reuters that the agreement was a comprehensive defensive agreement that encompassed all military means without explicitly mentioning nuclear sharing. Georgetown professor F. Gregory Goss, one of the foremost academic authorities on Saudi security policy, observed that the likelihood of Pakistan actually deploying nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia was highly unlikely given that Pakistani nuclear capability exists primarily to deter India, and that diverting nuclear capability to Gulf defense would leave Pakistan more vulnerable to its primary adversary. But the legal framework that the SMDA created was sufficient to introduce exactly the kind of uncertainty into Iranian planning that deterrence theory predicts will constrain an adversary's behavior. Iranian military planners could not simply dismiss the possibility of Pakistani nuclear involvement in a scenario where Iran's strikes on Saudi Arabia triggered the SMDA's collective defense clause, because dismissing that possibility meant accepting a catastrophic risk on an assumption that could prove wrong. The deliberate ambiguity of Pakistan's nuclear commitment served Saudi deterrence purposes far more effectively than a crystal clear and unambiguous statement of Pakistani nuclear protection would have, because clarity would have allowed Iran to make precise assessments of whether the nuclear threat was real, while ambiguity forced Iranian planners to plan for worst-case scenarios that constrained their operational options, even when their analytical assessments suggested Pakistan probably would not use nuclear weapons. On the American side, the SDA's discussions about civilian nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia added a parallel nuclear dimension. Saudi Arabia had been seeking American assistance with civilian nuclear power development as part of Vision 2030's plan to diversify the kingdom's energy mix and free up oil for export rather than domestic consumption. The question of whether American nuclear technology transferred to Saudi Arabia would come with enrichment restrictions that prevented the kingdom from pursuing a latent weapons capability had been the central sticking point in the civil nuclear negotiations, with MBS famously saying that Saudi Arabia would develop nuclear weapons if Iran did. The SDA's major non-NATO ally framework created a context in which those discussions would continue under conditions more favorable to Saudi interests than had existed before. And the mere existence of those discussions contributed to Iranian calculations about how far the Saudi-American nuclear relationship might eventually extend. The four-nation framework involving Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Egypt represented the most geographically ambitious, most institutionally novel, and strategically most comprehensive element of the security architecture that MBS assembled. The framework united four countries whose historical relationships with each other had been complicated by precisely the kind of political and religious rivalries that made their convergence in a security cooperation format so striking to regional analysts Saudi Arabia and Turkey had been bitter rivals over their respective visions of political Islam and over the fallout from the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018. Saudi Arabia and Egypt had fought each other through proxies in Yemen from 1962 to 1970. Turkey and Egypt had been on opposite sides of the Muslim Brotherhood question for years, and yet the Iran war had produced a convergence of strategic interests that overcame these historical frictions, at least temporarily, because all four countries shared a fundamental concern about Iranian regional dominance and about the reliability of external powers, whether American or otherwise, as security guarantors in an era of transactional American foreign policy. The framework's combined military assets were genuinely formidable. Turkey brought the second largest standing army in NATO with 480,000 active personnel and 380,000 reserves. A rapidly expanding domestic defense industry with combat-proven drone systems, naval vessels, and armored vehicles, and control of the Bosphorus Strait and the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt brought 440,000 active military personnel, making it the largest Arab armed force by a significant margin, control of the Suez Canal and the northern Red Sea that gave the coalition leverage over the world's most commercially important maritime chokepoint, and an arsenal modernized with French Rafale jets, 2 Mistral-class helicopter carriers, Italian Frem frigates, and Russian T-90 main battle tanks. Pakistan brought its nuclear arsenal and the deterrent ambiguity that came with it, as well as geographic positioning that bordered Iran directly and provided strategic depth that no Gulf state could offer. And Saudi Arabia brought financial power unmatched in the Muslim world, with a defense budget of $78 billion in 2025 that exceeded the other three members' combined defense spending, and the financial capacity to sustain joint programs and procurement initiatives across multiple decades. What makes the four-nation framework even more significant than the sum of its members' military capabilities is the geographic reach it creates across the most strategically critical corridors of the Eurasian landmass. Turkey controls the Bosphorus, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and giving the coalition influence over Russian naval access to warm water ports. Egypt holds the Suez Canal and the northern Red Sea, controlling the maritime route between Asia and Europe that carries approximately 15% of global trade in normal times, and that had been disrupted by Houthi attacks in 2023 and 2024. Pakistan borders both Iran and Afghanistan, providing land access routes and military staging possibilities in the eastern approaches to the Persian Gulf that no Gulf state possesses. Saudi Arabia sits at the geographic heart, the primary target of Iranian aggression, and the financial center that sustains the entire enterprise. The coalition's geographic footprint covers virtually every critical maritime chokepoint, land route, and energy transit corridor connecting the Middle East to the rest of the world, and it does so with military forces sufficient to defend those corridors in ways that no single member could manage independently. Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan's description of the coalition's purpose as learning to solve their own problems themselves, rather than waiting for an external hegemon, captured the fundamental strategic logic that binds four historically fractious countries together. The message to Tehran was explicit and deliberate. Iranian aggression against any one of these four countries would now trigger a collective response from a coalition that combined nuclear deterrence, the world's second largest NATO army, the largest Arab armed force, and the financial resources of the world's largest oil exporter. Whether that message has achieved the deterrence effect it was designed to produce is a question that the trajectory of the Iran war itself is answering in real time. The Iranian response to MBS's security architecture confirmed that Tehran understood exactly what had been constructed against it, and found the combination genuinely alarming, rather than merely diplomatically inconvenient. Iran had launched proxy attacks on Pakistani territory in January 2026, in what regional analysts widely interpreted as an attempt to deter Islamabad from activating the SMDA in the escalating Gulf conflict, and to test whether Pakistan's commitment to the pact was real or symbolic. Those attacks, which killed Pakistani citizens and drew a sharp diplomatic response from Islamabad, demonstrated that Iran recognized the SMDA as a genuine threat to its regional freedom of action, rather than as an empty gesture. The scale of Iranian attacks on Saudi Arabia after the war began on February 28th, including the single-day barrage of nearly 100 drones that hit the Aramco ExxonMobil refinery and targeted Prince Sultan Air Base, also reflected Iranian awareness that the American military presence on Saudi soil under the SDA's access provisions had made Saudi Arabia a more valuable and more legitimate target from Tehran's perspective, even as the security agreements had made it a harder one. Iran was simultaneously testing Saudi Arabia's defenses, demonstrating its capacity to inflict pain despite the multi-layered security architecture, and signaling that no amount of alliance building would make the kingdom invulnerable to Iranian retaliation if the war continued. The SMDA's deterrent effect was real but incomplete. Pakistan did not activate the collective defense clause during the initial weeks of the conflict, despite Saudi Arabia enduring the sustained Iranian strikes, a restraint that Georgetown's Professor Goss had anticipated when he observed before the war that Pakistan was unlikely to use nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia, and that the pact would not dramatically change Pakistani behavior in practice, even as its deterrent signaling was significant. What MBS had built was not an impenetrable shield. It was a strategic architecture that raised the costs and complications of Iranian aggression to levels that would eventually factor into Tehran's calculus about how far and how long to pursue the conflict, even if it could not prevent Iran from launching the attacks that had already been decided upon before the agreements were signed. What the historic defense architecture that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has constructed across the U.S.-Saudi Strategic Defense Agreement, the Saudi-Pakistani Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, and the four-nation Turkey-Egypt-Saudi Arabia-Pakistan framework reveals about his strategic vision for Saudi Arabia's future is something more fundamental and more enduring than a response to any specific crisis. It represents a comprehensive conclusion, reached through hard experience with the limits of informal security relationships, and through the existential shock of watching Iran demonstrate its willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz, regardless of the economic costs to itself, that Saudi Arabia's survival and prosperity in the 21st century require a formalized, multilateral, legally structured, and ideally nuclear-backed security architecture that no single American election can dismantle, and that no Iranian escalation campaign can intimidate into irrelevance. The U.S.-Saudi Strategic Defense Agreement gives the kingdom the legal status of a major non-NATO ally, with all the institutional, technological, and symbolic weight that designation carries, and creates a framework for embedded American military expertise and access that makes American protection more reliable than it has ever been before. The SMDA with Pakistan creates the first nuclear umbrella in the Islamic world and forces Iranian military planners to incorporate the possibility of Pakistani nuclear involvement into every scenario involving strikes on Saudi territory, introducing an uncertainty into Iranian calculations that serves Saudi deterrence at precisely the moment when Iranian missile and drone capabilities had reached levels that conventional air defense alone could no longer reliably neutralize. The four-nation framework creates a Sunni Muslim coalition of 500 million people, whose combined military capabilities, complementary geographic reach, and shared strategic interest in constraining Iranian regional dominance define a new regional power architecture that changes the fundamental balance of the Middle East in ways that will outlast the current war by decades. Whether this architecture ultimately achieves the permanent deterrence of Iranian aggression that MBS has been working towards since he recognized that Saudi Arabia's security could not indefinitely rest on American goodwill alone is the question that the coming years will answer. What is already clear is that no previous Saudi leader and no previous combination of Arab states has assembled a security framework of comparable scope, depth, legal structure, and deterrent credibility in the entire modern history of the region.